Well, seemingly nothing from the past can escape Hollywood's obsession with just selling audiences nostalgia. Not even toy lines from the 1980s. A He-Man and the Masters of the Universe movie being made in the year 2026 might be surprising, but for better or worse, the movie itself may be exactly what you might expect. Does Masters of the Universe have the power? I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So there's a moment in Masters of the Universe in which Adam Glenn, aka He-Man, holds the Sword of Power and declares, "By the power of Grayskull, I have the power." But then nothing happens. There is no epic transformation into a mighty warrior. And unfortunately, to me, that's sort of an encapsulation of this film as a whole. The classic characters, they are all here, but this film does not, in fact, have the power. There is some very modest fun to be had when the film is earnest about just embracing its very goofy source material, but for the most part, Masters of the Universe is more interested in lecturing about toxic masculinity and providing vulgar jokes to the now grown fans of those original toys than it is in attempting to conjure up that sense of, childlike imagination and wonder and adventure that made the source material beloved in the first place. Now, as you probably know, there's sort of like an old legend that inside each man there are two wolves. Well, I think inside Masters of the Universe there are two movies. One is a fun adaptation of a 1980s Saturday morning cartoon about a hyper-masculine hero, and the other is a 2026 film that is embarrassed and feels the need to apologize for being an adaptation of a 1980s Saturday morning cartoon about a hyper-masculine hero. When allowing the first to run free is a sort of sincere, tongue-in-cheek adventure, Masters of the Universe is, I think, amusing, at least at times. Unfortunately, it is the second wolf that proves to be the alpha here. Mattel, sort of the classic toy company, continues its very curious and interesting venture into Hollywood. As with Barbie back in 2023, rather than attempt to sort of recreate the original joy that the toys inspired, it instead uses its cinematic offering as almost a form of therapy or social commentary to guide now grown audiences on how to navigate what it apparently sees as its more complicated aspects of its product. And this movie is very clearly attempting to sort of catch lightning in a bottle again, as the film takes direct inspiration from the Barbie movie. So if you loved the heavy-handed sermonizing of Barbie, you're in luck. Because He-Man, who was actually never called that until the closing moments of this film, very much receives the Ken treatment as a bumbling and incompetent fool. And the film's message about masculinity is about as subtle as when He-Man picks up the limp body of a bad guy goon and uses it as a club. Now, I was personally pretty critical of the Barbie movie, but its message obviously struck a wide cultural nerve. So who knows, maybe this one will too. But it's just hard for me to have much fun with a movie that is just constantly telling you how problematic it is to do so. Also, and here's me speaking as a father, not just as a reviewer, but despite being a movie about a goofy cartoon based on some wacky toys, this movie isn't really aimed at kids. This is not made for the same young audience demographic that fell in love with the original cartoon in the 1980s. It's made for those same kids who are now middle-aged adults. Because there's seemingly no opportunity for a crude sexual allusion or euphemism that goes wasted by the filmmakers, because virtually every single attempt at humor is sexual in nature. There are frequent gags about characters fisting or giving head, or referring to a cowardly tiger as the P word. The Sword of Power is a phallic object, as audiences are explicitly told, in case the very heavy-handed references somehow weren't clear. And even a few jokes about masturbation and gay sex apparently mark the edge of its comedic range. Now, as expected, the film is heavy on CGI spectacle where really nothing feels real. Even my 11-year-old son actually remarked after we saw this movie, saying, "Was the movie supposed to look like an old video game?" I will say though that while these sort of modern Hollywood tendencies usually do kind of turn me off, it does work at times here with just the vibe of a goofy Saturday morning cartoon cartoon brought to life. In fact, like when focusing on simply recreating the wacky cartoon without rushing to apologize for or like deconstruct it, Masters of the Universe actually is like a decently fun adventure. The opening sequence, kind of before He-Man is transported to the real world, is quite promising. I think hints that it might be able to strike the perfect balance. I think much like the very underappreciated 2023 film Dungeons and Dragons, of being like goofy and self-deprecating about its source material, even as it like embraces it with earnestness and this clear love for it. For example, when asked why Skeletor is conquering Eternia, a woman says, because he's bad. And when He-Man suggests that there must be like a bit more to it than that, the woman remarks, he has a skull for a face. And I think that's great. I think it all is super silly, but I think that is part of its charm. And I do think Skeletor, who is played by actor Jared Leto, in particular is quite amusing all throughout. But where the film goes off the rails for me is when He-Man is sent to the real world. Not only does this lead to just an infusion of the same, I think, unwanted sort of modern cynicism and just snarky sense of humor that I find way too common these days, but it also totally shifts the focus of the film, where rather than being about like the story or the characters, it becomes more just a window to like explore our own relationship to those stories and characters, filtering sort of the 1980s tale through modern eyes and values, and which we'll get into a bit more in just a moment. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this, a lot more than at least I expected going in based on the source material. For language, there are plenty of minor profanities, including words that begin with the letters S, H, and A, and like I mentioned, also a couple uses of the P word. For violence, this is probably the least as far as concerning content here. Humans and creatures are killed in battle, but the action is like mostly cartoonish and bloodless. For sexuality, there is a ton going on here, because there are like frequent sexual innuendos. As I alluded to earlier, you have a character with a giant fist called Fisto, who continually talks about all the people he wants to fist, and he later asks his friend with like an oversized helmet called Ram Man to give him head. The Sword of Power is kind of repeatedly used all throughout as sort of being a phallic object, with one character even directly making the connection, saying that big sword dangling between your muscular thighs. And a scene in the real world in which He-Man looks for like his lost Sword of Power in like a collectibles shop contains a lot of jokes about men kind of mistaking his question, "Do you have my sword?" as expressing sexual interest. And like in that same scene is where you have a masturbation joke, and also He-Man, as he like attempts to dislodge the sword from like a life-size mannequin, he ends up in several positions that very clearly mimic sexual activity. The last thing, which is featured in a lot of the trailers, is you have Adam's name tag in the real world, like at his workplace, which does list his pronouns as he, him, which is obviously mostly playing for a joke, but also just something to take note of. As far as themes, worldview, things going on beneath the surface, I do think the idea of a He-Man movie being made in 2026 might be surprising, just given the cultural shift, I think for better or worse, away from like traditional depictions of masculinity. So I think it's perhaps not surprising that He-Man was like dropped from the film's title, and like Adam is only named as such at like the very end of the film, with much ridicule from like the other characters around him. So I think like, as with Barbie, the central message of Masters of the Universe is a very, I think, heavy-handed exploration and like deconstruction of masculinity. And to be clear, I think there are some valid and like potentially interesting themes to explore here. Some expressions of masculinity are, in fact, toxic, but the film just lacks like the subtlety or like the nuance to have those meaningful conversations. Every like male character in this film is a totally incompetent fool, none more so than He-Man himself, who needs to be constantly lectured by women who spend most of their own screen time just like rolling their eyes in disappointment at like the attempted masculine displays of the men. And there's like a very telling quote by the once legendary warrior Duncan, aka Man at Arms, who has become in this film like a deadbeat drunk, who tells his daughter something along the lines of, "You're the man I always wished I could be." And in one sense, that gets very clearly framed as like a joke, but I think it also reflects just the film's message about men, that to be a good man is to reject the trappings of like traditional masculinity and embrace more like traditionally feminine characteristics. Early in the film, Duncan gives Adam a speech about how to like be a man means to be strong and like protect those you love. And it's actually, I think, a great moment, kind of similar to the very like positive message in Avatar 2, The Way of Water. But the film itself mostly downplays that idea. And like instead, the pivotal moment of like growth between those two characters is when those men kind of together learn to like express their feelings and cry together. And like at the end of the film, it's not like the duty of protection that gets emphasized, but is Duncan asking Adam, "So how is it going with your feelings?" And as I mentioned earlier, kind of throughout the film, the sword of power becomes a clear stand-in for a penis and like this representative of macho masculinity. And ultimately, the sword is at least like temporarily broken as Adam learns to like embrace the power that is in him and not just in his sword. And in his like final showdown with Skeletor, he sleeves his sword and like attempts to embrace his real-world experience as a therapist to de-escalate the situation. And while he is like ultimately forced to fight, the scene is, to me, just a fitting picture of like how out of place the masculine He-Man feels in his own movie, and like the film's almost like last resort reluctance just to celebrate his strength. So in the end, my biggest issue with Masters of the Universe is not just that I don't think it's a very good movie, but that I think it's also representative of so many of the other sort of frustrating tendencies that have made audiences become more and more like disillusioned with Hollywood in recent years. The reason that He-Man can't even receive a blockbuster adaptation in 2026 is because the toys and cartoon instilled wonder in kids, but instead of like attempting to do the same again for a new generation, Hollywood seems content to just sell nostalgia to its now grown original audience. And then rather than even like celebrate that nostalgic property, it feels compelled to deconstruct it. And so I'm left to wonder, is it just too much for Hollywood to make a movie based on childhood toys that merely celebrates the reason that we fell in love with them in the first place, rather than just use the film as a pulpit to lecture nostalgic audiences on why their childhood loves were so problematic? I think if Barbie and now Masters of the Universe are anything to go by, then sadly, the answer to that question seems clear. But hey, I would love to hear what you think if you, grew up with the toys or the cartoon, or maybe just have a more positive experience with this film than I did. Don't be shy, jump into the comment section, let's have a conversation on it. If you haven't done so too, I encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel, become a Collider, got lots of other movie reviews, got our Faith and Pop Culture podcast, got interviews, just other fun stuff. Would love to have you guys be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching, stay safe, and continue to collide with your world for Christ.